One of the most overlooked ethnic groups in the world is not in the rainforests of Africa or forests of Indonesia. It is in one of the most beautiful countries in the world that also happens to be its own continent, Australia. The Aborigines people of inner and coastal Australia are some of the most oppressed peoples in the world. After being overrun by white Europeans in 1788, everything the Aboriginal people of Australia knew was forgotten, with its people being treated like animals or subhuman. After holding claim over Australia for upwards of 40,000 years, the Aboriginal people were quickly forced to abandon their ways of life and accept European ideals. However, after roughly 200 years under European rule, the indigenous populations of Australia are slowly beginning to demand more and more rights and even identify as their own nationality in their own nation. To begin with, the Aboriginal people of Australia are a very spiritual people. They believed that they were connected to the earth and even called their planet Mother. They believe that once you die, you are recycled back into the earth, meaning that every tree or bush is remnants of human souls. This is a main part of their religious system, which came to be known as the Dreaming. Not only were the Aborigines a very spiritual group, they were also a society deeply engrossed in ritual. When boys hit puberty, they were forced to participate in difficult acts and self-mutilation that would ultimately mark their entry into manhood. The indigenous populations of Australia possessed more than 700 languages that were soon cut down to roughly 200 by the turn of the 20th century. None of the Aboriginal languages were written down. Instead, stories were passed from generation to generation by word of mouth in the form of songs and stories. As part of their new nationalist movements, Aborigines are beginning to reteach the Aboriginal languages to younger generations so that that significant part of their history can survive. Almost all of the Aboriginal tribes were nomads, meaning they traveled from one place to another. They were hunter-gatherers and stayed in close family units, so whatever they picked for their own family. When the white Europeans came in 1788, their way of life seemed to come to a screeching halt. The Europeans took away their land and basically crowded them into large pens to live. The history of the Aborigines became cloudy over the next 200 or so years, but soon popped up again during the early 20th century. Aborigines were banned from using white swimming pools, cinemas, hotels, and clubs. In 1967, a referendum was passed, which meant Aborigines were finally recognized as people and citizens of Australia and no longer treated as less than human. Until 1969, the Aboriginal Protection or Welfare Boards oversaw the lives of the Aborigines. These boards could decide what jobs Indigenous people could have, what property they could own, and even who they could marry. These restrictions seemed eerily similar to those imposed on both Native Americans and blacks during the 1960s civil rights era. Fortunately, these boards were disbanded in 1969. During the 1960s, Australia saw huge nationalist movements among the Aboriginal people. The television was a main source of communication among different Aboriginal groups. The 1970s also saw the rise of extreme separatist groups that were willing to resort to violence in order to regain rights they should already have. This group was known as the Australian Black Panther Party. The Australian Black Panther Party was similar to the Black Panther Party, a group that committed acts of violence in order to gain equal rights for blacks during the civil rights era of the United States. The nationalist movements among Aborigines were spearheaded by Indigenous Australians assimilated and educated by white European schools. Along with land ownership, proper education has been a rapid debate amongst Europeans and Indigenous Australians. White Australians are now trying to incorporate Aboriginal mythology into modern science out of respect for the Indigenous populations. In the 1990s, a flag representing the Aboriginal people was created and flaunted during sporting events, leading to a rise in Aboriginal nationalism. The concern over land rights was and still is the main driving force for Aboriginal nationalism. Although the rise of Aboriginal nationalism has been slow and steady, it is quickly gaining supporters from both white Australians and Indigenous Australians. Compared to the nationalist movements in Ireland or Spain, the nationalist movements of Australia are relatively brand new. After 2 centuries of discrimination and dehumanization by the Europeans, the Indigenous populations of Australia are slowly rising to the occasion. They are beginning to fight for the rights of the land that belonged to their ancestors and finally be recognized as a unique ethnicity that inhabited Australia long before their white European counterparts.